Welcome to Last Week Today, a blatant ripoff of John Oliver's Last Week Tonight because there is no better way to speak about this issue other than using this style. Our main story today concerns college housing. Those of you who graduated college might remember the dorms that looked like this. They were small, cramped, and just the bare minimum. Odds are you probably didn't have your own bathroom and had to share a floor or a hall bathroom. After all, it's your first time living away from home. You don't need anything too fancy, and this is pretty much in line with the original purpose of American colleges. Colleges were initially built in the middle of nowhere, and that's by design. The first U.S. colleges were sponsored by Protestant denominations and tended to be isolated in rural locations or small towns to distance students from the corrupting influence of the city. Corrupting influence of the city? Administrators emphasized the need for moral education as well as an academic one, so the undergraduate experience took on a semi-monastic aura. I spoke too soon. The article points out that dorms weren't always a separate building. At Harvard, the classrooms were right next to the student dorms. This building, Massachusetts Hall, is old enough to have lived through the Revolutionary War. Now today, Massachusetts Hall houses the office of the Harvard president and 14 freshman students. This arrangement sounds like a setup of a Disney Channel sitcom, and to that I say, what could possibly go wrong? Now that I say, what could possibly go wrong, it could be like this. Time West Point had a bunch of drunken students throw a riot and take over the dorms. One of those drunken students was Jefferson Davis. And many of the drunken students had to be bailed out by Robert E. Lee, who tried to vouch for them because Lee was a teacher's pet. I'm not advocating for the Massachusetts Hall freshmen to get drunk and have a riot, but if someone wants to turn that into a sketch comedy, feel free. Anyways, if you think dorms were meant to have communities blend together like how dorms advertise themselves as diverse people coming together, you are vastly mistaken. When Harvard founded its Indian college, living together wasn't anything on anyone's mind. The Indian students were segregated off into their own building. White students did not need to live anywhere near the native ones. But Cyril, what does this have to do with campus housing today? Well, let's jump into the aftermath of World War II. In 1944, the GI Bill was signed into law. When the war ended, veterans, at least the ones who weren't black, got to partake in higher education for the first time. This led into an increased need for housing. If your image of a dorm is a densely crowded space, that's probably why this stereotype exists. When I was an undergrad, the oldest dorms closely resembled the dense spaces you expect to see. They also probably had a mold problem. The newer ones more closely resemble this hotel room, and that wasn't just at my college. The Wall Street Journal did an investigation and found that Arizona State University students paid 80% more than what their contemporaries did 20 years ago, and that's inflation adjusted. And where do these students get the money to pay for all this? Newly redone dorms are not cheap after all. They have to go into debt. Housing prices zoomed past tuition at several schools. That's not a two-sentence horror story, that's a one-sentence horror story. Let's add another to see how much worse that we can make this. Many colleges require first-year students to live on campus. Let's break down the insanity of this all by using University of Massachusetts Amherst for just a second. For an in-state student in the 2024-2025 school year, there is an $18,000 tuition, a $9,000 housing on average, and an $8,000 food fee, because you need to eat after all. That means, in total, this is around $35,000. I'm not even throwing other expenses in there, like saran wrap bags of loose leaf paper that pretend to be textbook that are like $250 a piece, the stupid access code to do homework, which costs like $250 a piece, basic school supplies like paper, and your car's upkeep like gasoline because, let's face it, obviously you'll need a job to pay for college because these rates are insane. Then you get angry and realize your bartending job won't pay for the degree even though your degree is in electrical engineering. Then you need to get some healthcare for the fact that you just punched your laptop getting frustrated at your income statements. Then you need to pay for the hospital stay, which then you die of a heart attack, the side of the hospital bill. But then it gets worse. Well, maybe not for you since you're dead, but if you weren't dead, let's just use Montclair State University in New Jersey as a sample for what comes next. This right here is the Heights. It's a dorm built and managed by a private developer. It's a public school, but the housing was built and managed by a private company. These developers set their own rates on how much housing should cost, and they send the bill to you, the student, and then they split the money with themselves and the school. After all, the university owns the land, the developer does everything else, from building, maintaining, and then we do this for a set amount of years, let's say 30 years on the low end. The school gets to keep a good chunk of the money and won't have to worry about direct administration for things like maintenance for a few decades. This industry is so big that there are even companies formed around the concept of developing for universities. Take American campus communities, for example. Who happens to be in charge of these wonderful campuses? If you're thinking of renting off campus and thinking that's any better, you may be a bit batty because rent in America is not low. Obviously, one student can't afford rent, so they take a bunch of roommates in order to afford the rent. Now, if you're thinking so many people crowded into a small place sounds like a disease or fire hazard, especially when your landlord doesn't keep up with the building's fire alarm, you'd be correct. Binlin Lee died in a house fire this way. So let's say you want to become an engineer and make a good salary. You get paid less for not having a degree. You go to a state university, you get forced into staying on campus, and then break the bank or go to the closest university to you, which is still pretty far from home, so you are forced to stay on campus anyways. The price tag already requires the salary of an engineer or at least a mildly skilled salaried worker. Okay, so you see off-campus housing is slightly cheaper, but you need to take a bunch of roommates in to actually make rent. Coupled by a neglectful landlord, the house catches fires and the inhabitants die of smoke inhalation. I think it's long overdue that we need to get some kind of perspective here. Understatement of the century, I know, but the fact is that students need to put up with this insanity. Higher education in this country is treated like a business when it should be treated like infrastructure. Chemists, doctors, teachers, mechanical engineers, and more all need degrees. Society wouldn't function without these people. Now, we can argue all we want over whether college should be more job training or more making a knowledgeable person, but that's all moot when you realize that students can't be the best students they possibly can be if they're constantly facing insecurity in housing, much less in tuition and books, and afterwards they'll be worse off than when they started out college, and then basically no one gets to do the jobs we need. But those are just my thoughts. Please consider liking, subscribing, tipping the channel on Ko-fi. This is Cyril signing off.